Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Agency Handbook on Cyber and the Hybrid Cloud, sponsored by VMware on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Jay Huey, the Cloud Portfolio Director at the Technology Transformation Service in the General Services Administration, Todd Myers, the Automation Lead CIOT at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Ben Bergerson, the CIO and Senior Agency Official for Cyber Risk Management at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and Bill Rowan, the Vice President of Federal Sales for VMware. Toward the end of that first segment, we started talking about the flexibility, the resiliency, security came up. Let me go start with Ben, though, in the end there. One of the things that this is leading us down the path in terms of resiliency and flexibility is almost a new model. Talk a little bit about the new model that maybe you guys are starting to look at.
We're starting to look at everything as a service where you've got resiliency, robustness, backups, restoration, audit logging, cybersecurity, all rolled into the service. And that's just part of the expectations is where's the value to the mission and security is baked in, then you're not worried about putting in weaknesses and vulnerability remediation and POEM items after the fact. It's here's your emergency communication system, and of course it's in a highly secure environment in two different cloud areas. And we are looking at paying the annual service fee for that communication system. The same thing for web portals out in the cloud. It's in a clustered environment, of course, and if one machine goes down or one container is under maintenance, then the other one just slides over. It's really cool. When you get to everything as a service, you're close to the mission and figuring out how you can help U.S. exports as to compared to how many servers are up at the moment.
Do you find that as a service, though, from a pay for use perspective, is that something that you have to start with a baseline and say, okay, what's emergency communications? Are we paying by the drink? Are we paying by the what? Like how do you deal with the pay issue? I guess was the cost.
We end up paying per user, and that makes it very flexible. So if we go to a foreign country and we need to spin up 5 accounts for some people in country, and then 2 months later we need to spin it down, we only pay for what we use. And we've saved a couple $1 million over the last few years by just paying for our services that we use. The same thing in backups. We only pay for what we back up, not an entire data center, but what we need. And so pay as you go, you would wonder, is it going to cost more? But it actually allows you to say, this is how much this service costs for this analytics project for this country, and you can do cost management, savings, and efficiencies.
Are you charging your mission areas now by the user? You don't have to answer that if you don't want to.
They want my savings back to go into the mission. That's how that goes.
We can talk about MGT. Todd, you guys are in a similar situation. Are you guys also in that model of as a service and pay by the drink or pay by the user?
Well, so
a little different.
It's a little different. What we've established is an abstraction for what we call customers or capabilities that come in at a third tier. So they're not coming in and maintaining and patching their systems. Matter of fact, they don't own their systems anymore. They consume the services or frameworks, whether it's Kafka or Spark or whatever the case would be, that we're providing, and we're taking care of how that scales across not only the cloud but also bare metal. I wanted to mention that as part of the other components that we're looking at is we don't want to be patching anything that's running. When something's running, it's running for a purpose, and when there's a next development cycle of that code, we remove that machine or that cluster and we bring in the next series of code. So that impacts the way we interact with DISA with respect to NIST controls. All that has to be rolled back to the software code baseline, which really gets into the DevOps pipeline, right? So developers and academia and industry partners are going to be part of that back code development versus throwing something over the fence for us to bring in the door and then deploy. So we're really focused on making sure that the things that are been inhibiting us from deploying things at scale in a timely fashion and very costly are actually rolled into the code base.
And the other very interesting thing here is, as you are adding new capabilities, that's getting tested throughout the entire code. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the new capabilities that's being tested and then it breaks something down, in the back end of the code. Everything gets Go ahead.
So I set that stage because the term everything as a service is an interesting term. Effectively, you're talking about fully maturated code pipeline deployments, and in the context of which, if a developer is making a tweak for a specific function, that's in the context of the greater cluster, right? Not as a service. There are declared software hosting services. What I'm talking about are things that are running as utility, so to speak, abstracting the cloud environment.
Right.
Well,
More than that.
yeah, far more than that. Specific mission applications that get into image analysis and collection and things of that nature.
Bill, let me bring you in here on this as a service model. Are you seeing a trend, or are you seeing agencies asking for this approach, not just as a service, but also the pay by the drink or pay as you go?
So there's really a couple different dynamics that are working at scale. Agencies who are starting to use an as-a-service model are trying to figure out how can they move some of their other budget line items to that particular type of model. I think most agencies feel like they have the O&M dollars to operate, especially as they're seeing savings, there's additional dollars there. Capital is always very, very tight, has been always been very, very tight. Some of the new things we've seen in the NDAA, as you alluded to, may help some of that, but that's going to operate somewhat like a working capital fund, so there'll be other pieces down the line. So they're clearly asking for it. I think the stumbling block becomes they don't exactly know what they want their internal model to look like. And I think that's a little bit of the evolution that we've discussed here is there's two dynamics going on. Services are being delivered differently. Agencies are consuming services differently. And then there's the contracting aspect of how do I contract to get those various services in a timely fashion. So we're stretching different parts of the organizations. I think that generally speaking, agencies are determining what services they consume, how they can consume more things as a service because it's advantageous budget-wise, and then how does that allow them to potentially tackle other technical or business issues, mission issues, if you will, that they simply could not get to because they didn't have the funds. This type of approach allows them to go after some of those particular things, but again, there are other areas that also are driving concerns, contracts being probably one of the major ones.
So, part of our evolution is also massively separating our monolithic systems data from the top application stacks. And so we have a major thrust to isolate in a virtual private cloud, Amazon technology speak, all of our content. And rather than a program moving their applications or their system into a VPC along with their data, we're architecting with our chief data officer an open data store construct that allows any program to deploy just the application logic and then point to their VPC. So now we've defined a shared business model that allows folks to focus on the content and the access controls and the PEP and the PAP parameters to those data sources, and then we can refine a much more focused area on the application logic.
And will this also make the applications perform better because they're not slowed down by all the data because the data is, if you will, stored somewhere else and a web service
We're
is...
seeing trends towards that, but more importantly, it's evolving more towards operating like a Facebook or an Apple data center, which is really the industry that we need to go toward, or the go towards way industry is doing this, because the days of a contract or RFI or vendors coming up and providing their solution to give to someone to deploy as a snowflake in the VPCs is interesting. It doesn't meet the mission demand and the timeline, and it's very, very costly. So we're basically going back to the way if Walmart and Kmart were going to merge, they have to look at their lines of business and see how they consolidate things. So we've got application environments and we've got our data environment. We're doing massive computation analytics against the imagery data, and so that affords a new way of thinking of just orchestration and automation writ large.
Jay, jump in here, because one of the things that you're working on is around the centers of excellence, and you're leading part of that effort around the cloud adoption piece. Talk a little bit about where this as a service plays into that, or the broader trends you're seeing.
Well, I think what I hear about this conversation is granularity. And the one thing I'd encourage your listeners is to not think that security has to apply equally to every service, right? Todd used the term utility before, and I really like that. If something's a nice to have, but it's not critical to your business, you would not protect that the same way that an ERP system or an HR system or your imagery system, right? And what to Bill's point, this gives the agency the ability in contract to kind of be more granular around cost and value. Right, what is the cost of this SLA I think I'm imposing? Instead of just slapping contract language on from one service to the next, I can really look into it in a much more refined fashion. And so I don't want to dissuade anyone from being secure, right? But I think that it's about that value statement. I played wiffle ball with my son this weekend, which is much different than playing baseball at the Nationals level, right? The equipment's different, the field's different. They're very different structures, and frankly, if we broke a bat, no big deal. We'd go to the park and go down the slide. So that's the conversation I'm seeing agencies start to have. From the Centers of Excellence perspective, Gary Washington's doing an amazing job at USDA. All the team there, we're really having this much more granular perspective on how the agency can leverage these utilities, these capabilities across the products and programs.
I think it gives specific focus on the portions of the elements of the granularity that both contractor and government individuals and organizations writ large can focus on. So one of our goals is to not have our security folks just be risk assessors, but actually be team players. And so we've identified a couple of folks that are going to be onboarding onto our team as part of the automation deployments. So we're starting to see this blender effect of putting things together. And out of that, it may not look so pretty in the beginning, but ultimately we're going to get to a faster way of deploying, trusted known state of things that are being deployed, knowing where the routes and ACLs and all those components need to be put in place, obfuscation, network overlays. You could keep on talking about this for days on end. But the point is that the way in which companies like Uber and Airbnb and Twitter and Facebook, not recently, but what they've been doing as far as deploying new capabilities like Cassandra, which came out of Facebook, and LinkedIn, so Kafka, they really focused on the longer term effect, not the short term deploy, right? So I'm going to need my security folks, not my security folks, but security folks that work at our agency to roll their sleeves up and get engaged and understand that their job is not to review a spreadsheet. Their job is to understand the technologies that are coming around the corner, understand where they're now going to fit in the bigger picture. The same thing with folks that are today the data center management folks. They're going to start to need to learn how to do infrastructure as code. So when they do deployments, they're not thinking about patching machines. They're thinking about cluster load balances at multi-data center regions and globally.
Bill, jump in.
Well, I think that this is an interesting dialogue, and Todd's spot on. I think there's the other part too is as this security model evolves, one of the things that we're out talking to clients about is the building of a zero trust model when it comes to the security framework. There are all kinds of, as we separate the data from the application piece itself, the question becomes how do we easily share that data? We see that time and again, as we have bolted security onto the process, that's where we become the most vulnerable. We build security in from the very beginning. We've taken a concept much like General Clappert used to talk about. If we designed our networks much like we designed our submarines, if there was a breach, we'd seal off that particular compartment and continue on with the mission. There's a similar analogy here relative to our networks, especially as we start to separate the data from the applications so that people get a greater share of how to utilize that environment. This changes that model a little bit, but I don't believe it's a one-time change. The models will continue to evolve. But at the same time, we'll get greater access, we'll get greater agility, we'll get better performance. We'll ultimately have a much better security, more robust security model that, again, continue to be leveraged across government or across industry in general.
Bill, do me a quick favor and just let's define zero trust model, just in case the listeners aren't familiar with the term.
So just at the very highest level concepts is that I'm going to give you access to someone to information, but not until I authenticate them on a regular basis, whether that's to an individual, a user group, an agency, a department, and I will start to learn their characteristics. How do they operate? How do they come into me? Maybe I build additional firewalling capability again, and this is going to be done in software in a virtual environment, but we never assume that there's no risk. We assume all the time that, in fact, there's 100% risk, and that until we've gotten that handshake back and forth and can identify who it is or what organization is using the data or trying to access the information, we're not going to give them the authority to get the data. And I think, again, we're trying to keep that at the highest level. Certainly the implementation becomes a little bit more complex when we get down to it, but at a high level, that's the best way to, we think, to kind of continue to approach this game.
Jay?
I just build on that. I love the submarine analogy, but it's less about building our networks like submarines and more about building our applications like submarines, right? And I think the term zero trust, I love it, but it almost points people to the wrong end of the stick. It's about high trust applications and the identity that Bill talked about and the data security that Todd talked about. It's about focusing the expertise and the knowledge in that application to be secure, because it's the best positioned to know what constitutes a threat or standard use, and less about building networks that continue to have this perimeter-based drive security into the networks, because they can't be all for everything.
So data is the network, and container isolated namespaces are the ports and network enclaves, if you want to think of them that way. So perimeter defense used to be the term, 15, 20 years ago, and then you heard defense, we started hearing defense in depth. That was really a reaction to still maintaining perimeter defense. Really, the applications is the network. I may have a TLS session between a container to another container, and that container goes away. I want to be able to have forensic analysis as to what transpired, so I have to follow that data network path at scale. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of containers, of course, across the year, and being able to analyze that, a log transition from that, and not have to go to machine and dump logs out of whether it's virtualized or whether it's bare metal. So it's a daunting task to comprehend thousands and thousands of containers running every hour on a host that may not run there tomorrow, right? So data is the network going forward.
Yep. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can talk about where we're going in the future. You're listening to the panel discussion, Agency Handbook on Cyber and the Hybrid Cloud, sponsored by VMware on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.